Time has a way of bringing back what we thought was lost forever. For Thomas Reeves, a widowed farmer who spent decades tending his Prairie Grove land alone, that truth arrives in the form of a broken-down luxury car and its mysterious owner seeking shelter from a storm. The elegant woman standing in his kitchen bears little resemblance to Eleanor Williams, the girl who left town 50 years ago with nothing but dreams in her suitcase. Now she's returned as a self-made billionaire, carrying a lifetime of success and one unchanging truth: she never stopped loving the boy she left behind. Dawn broke over Prairie Grove Farm like it had every morning for the past 43 years, painting the sky in watercolor strokes of pink and gold. Thomas Reeves had been awake long before the sun, his internal clock as reliable as the rooster that once prowled his farmyard. But this morning felt different. The air inside his old farmhouse held an unfamiliar tension, like static before a storm. In the kitchen, his movements were deliberate, quieter than usual. The coffee pot's gentle percolating seemed louder than normal in the pre-dawn stillness, and he found himself reaching for the good cups, the ones Sarah had insisted on keeping for company, rather than his usual chipped mug. His weathered hands paused over a particular cup, one he hadn't used in years. Prairie Grove High Class of '73, printed in faded gold letters against ceramic white. The sound of footsteps on his creaking stairs made him straighten. Suddenly, conscious of his worn flannel shirt and the silver hair he hadn't bothered to comb, Eleanor Williams appeared in his kitchen doorway like an apparition from another world. Designer silk pajamas beneath a cashmere robe, her silver hair elegantly styled even after sleeping. The contrast between her refinement and his rustic kitchen made his throat tight. "Good morning," she said, her voice carrying the same gentle lilt he remembered from 50 years ago, though perhaps a bit huskier now. "I hope I'm not too early." "Been up since 4. Thomas replied, sliding the class reunion mug back into the cabinet and reaching for 2 plain ones instead. Force of habit. Farm doesn't know weekends. Eleanor moved into the kitchen with grace that seemed at odds with the worn linoleum floor beneath her feet. "Some habits never change. You always were the first one up for morning chores, even back then." The reference to their shared past hung in the air between them. Thomas busied himself with pouring coffee, buying time before he had to look at her directly. When he finally turned, 2 steaming cups in hand, he found her studying the kitchen with curious eyes. "It's exactly as I remembered," she said softly, accepting the coffee. "That crack in the ceiling from when lightning struck in '72, the window that never quite closes properly, even the view of the old oak tree." Thomas settled into his usual chair at the kitchen table, gesturing for her to take Sarah's seat, something that caused an unexpected pang in his chest. "Not much reason to change things. Farm runs fine as it is." Eleanor's fingers traced the rim of her cup. "Sometimes the things that seem unchanged on the surface hide the deepest transformations." She took a sip, then added, "Your coffee's improved. At least you used to brew it strong enough to strip paint." A chuckle escaped him before he could catch it. "Sarah taught me better, said she wouldn't spend 50 years drinking motor oil." The mention of his late wife brought a flicker of something across Eleanor's face, too quick to read, gone before he could name it. She turned toward the window, where the morning light was growing stronger, illuminating the dew on his fields. "I should call about my car," she said, though she made no move to reach for the sleek phone he'd seen her place on his counter the night before. "I'm sure my assistant can arrange for a tow truck." Thomas felt the weight of years in his joints as he stood, carrying his empty cup to the sink. "Roads'll still be muddy from the storm. Might want to wait till they dry out a bit." He paused, then added, "Got plenty of room here if you need to stay another night." The offer surprised them both. Eleanor's eyes met his, and for a moment he saw past the elegant exterior to something familiar, the girl who used to sit on his father's tractor, dreaming out loud about all the places she'd go someday. Then she blinked, and she was once again the sophisticated stranger in his kitchen. "Thank you," she said carefully. "That's very kind." Outside, a mourning dove called, its mournful song drifting through the window. Thomas nodded toward the sound. "Barn needs checking. Make yourself at home." He headed for the door, then stopped, one hand on the frame. "There's fresh eggs in the fridge if you're hungry. Still remember how you like them?" "Over easy," they said in unison, and something shifted in the air between them, like the first crack in winter ice, small but significant. Thomas stepped out into the morning light, his boots leaving prints in the dew-damp grass. Behind him, through the window, he could hear the gentle clink of Eleanor moving about his kitchen, and he wondered if she was using that class of 73 mug after all. By mid-morning, the sun had burned away the last traces of dew, and Thomas found himself walking his property line with Eleanor at his side. She'd changed into what he supposed passed for casual wear in her world. Tailored pants and a silk blouse that probably cost more than his monthly fuel budget. Still, she didn't hesitate to follow him along the rutted dirt paths. "The north field's all soybeans now," he explained, gesturing to the expanse of green stretching toward the horizon. "Used to be corn back when—" He caught himself. But the words had already formed between them. "Back when you were here." Eleanor completed the thought anyway. "Back when we'd sneak out here on summer nights. Your father never did catch us." "He knew," Thomas said, surprised by the smile tugging at his lips. "Told me years later he always knew." They crested a small rise, and there it sat, the old farmal tractor, its red paint faded to a dusty coral, rust claiming the edges but still proudly upright. Eleanor's steps faltered for just a moment. "You kept it," she said softly. "Still." "Runs," Thomas replied, running a weathered hand along its hood. "Use it mostly for hay rides during the harvest festival now." The memory rose unbidden between them. A 17-year-old Eleanor perched on the tractor's fender, her hair catching the last light of sunset, while Thomas told her all his plans for the farm. She'd listened, head tilted just so, then told him about the acceptance letter from that business school out east, the one she hadn't shown her parents yet. "I remember you said this old machine would outlast us all," Eleanor mused, her manicured fingers tracing the same path his had. "Guess you were right about that." Thomas watched her hand move across the metal, noting how, despite all her obvious wealth, she touched the tractor with genuine reverence. "Some things are built to last," he said, the words carrying more weight than he'd intended. They continued their tour, passing the renovated chicken coop, where a handful of hens pecked contentedly at the ground. Eleanor smiled at their antics, and Thomas found himself explaining his small egg business, supplying the local farmers market and a few high-end restaurants in the nearest city. "Always did have a head for business," Eleanor remarked. "Even back then, you knew exactly how many bushels you needed to break even. Nothing compared to what you've done, I expect." He kept his tone neutral, though curiosity had been gnawing at him since she'd arrived. The Eleanor he'd known had dreamed big, but the woman beside him had clearly achieved far more than either of them had imagined possible. She waved off the implicit question. Different worlds entirely. Corporate boardrooms don't hold a candle to bringing something up from the earth with your own hands. There was a note of wistfulness in her voice that caught him off guard. They approached the old oak tree that marked the western edge of his property. Its massive branches stretched overhead like protective arms, leaves rustling in the warm breeze. Eleanor stopped in its shade, looking up at the gnarled limbs. "Our initials are still there," she said quietly. "Aren't they?" Thomas nodded, though. He hadn't looked at that particular spot in years. 20 feet up, carved into bark that had grown around the marks like a scar healing, were their initials and a date. TR plus EW Summer 73. "Last thing we did together," he said, the words coming out before he could stop them. "Night before you left." Eleanor's composure slipped for just a moment, a flash of old pain crossing her features. "I thought—" She stopped, collected herself. "Well, it doesn't matter what I thought then. We were just kids." But they hadn't been just kids, and they both knew it. That summer had been full of desperate intensity, the kind that only comes when you know something precious is slipping through your fingers. They'd talked about making it work somehow. Her going to school, him running the farm, finding some way to bridge their different dreams. In the end, though, she'd chosen her path, and he'd chosen his. Thomas cleared his throat. Should show you the new irrigation system. Put it in last spring. He started walking again, deliberately steering them away from the oak and its memories. Eleanor fell into step beside him, her shoulder occasionally brushing his as they navigated the uneven ground. The contact, though fleeting, sent little jolts through him each time, like static electricity building up between them. "You've done well here, Thomas," she said, as they approached the barn. "Everything is so alive, thriving." He glanced at her, caught something that looked almost like regret in her expression. "Had help. Sarah was good with plants. Started our first greenhouse." He paused. "And now I've got Pete Myers' boy helping out part-time, studying agricultural science at the State College." "Pete Myers? The same Pete Myers who used to copy my algebra homework?" Thomas nodded, and suddenly they were both laughing, the sound startling a pair of sparrows from their perch on the barn roof. It felt good, that shared laughter. Familiar and strange all at once, like finding an old favorite shirt in the back of a closet and discovering it still fit. The moment passed, but something had shifted again, the air between them growing a little warmer, a little more comfortable. They completed their tour in companionable silence, ending up back at the farmhouse just as the noon sun peaked overhead. Thomas watched Eleanor climb his porch steps, noting how naturally she moved through his world, despite all the years and differences between them. She paused at the door, turning back to him with an unreadable expression. "Thank you," she said, "for showing me everything." He nodded, understanding she meant more than just the tour. "Lunch?" he offered. "Still make a decent sandwich." Her smile reached her eyes this time. "I'd like that." As they headed inside, Thomas couldn't help but wonder what other memories might surface before Eleanor's car got fixed, and whether he was ready to face them all. Late afternoon sunlight slanted across the farmhouse windows as Eleanor wandered toward the back of the property. Thomas had excused himself to make some calls about feed deliveries, and she'd found herself drawn to a splash of color she'd glimpsed. Beyond the old tool shed, as she rounded the corner, she stopped short, her breath catching in her throat. Before her stretched a garden unlike anything she'd expected on a working farm. Wildflowers of every variety painted the space in swathes, of purple, yellow, and deep red. Black-eyed Susans nodded in the breeze alongside purple coneflowers, while clusters of butterfly weed attracted monarchs that danced between the blooms. At the center stood a hand-crafted wooden bench, its rich cedar weathered to a soft gray. Carved into its back with careful precision was a single name, Sarah. "Found it, did you?" Thomas's voice came from behind her, gentle but carrying a note of something protective. Eleanor turned, feeling oddly like an intruder. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "Sarah must have loved flowers." "Started as a vegetable garden," Thomas said, moving to stand beside her. "Sarah got tired of looking at neat rows all the time. Said if she was going to spend her days working in straight lines on the farm, she wanted something wild to come home to." He smiled faintly at the memory. "Before I knew it, she had half the county bringing her seeds and cuttings." Eleanor studied his face as he looked out over the riot of colors. "Tell me about her," she asked, then quickly added, "Only if you want to." Thomas was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. Then he moved toward the bench, gesturing for her to join him. As they sat, a goldfinch landed nearby, pecking at some seeds. "Met her at the farmer's market in '75, he began. "She was selling honey from her family's apiary. Had this way of talking about bees that made you understand. Why they called them colonies, like each hive was its own little civilization." He paused, absently touching the carved letters of her name. "She knew about you. Told me straight off that she wasn't looking to replace anybody's memories, just hoping to make new ones." Eleanor felt something twist in her chest. She sounds wise. She was. Practical, too. Made this place more than just a farm, made it a home. He gestured to a patch of deep purple blooms. Those were her favorite, Mexican sage. Said they reminded her of twilight. A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the buzz of bees and the distant call of killdeer. Eleanor found herself studying Thomas's hands, still strong despite their age, resting on his knees. Those same hands had once held hers. During summer dances, had wiped away her tears the night she told him about the scholarship, had now carved his wife's name into this bench with obvious care. 7 years is a long time to tend a garden alone, she said finally. Thomas nodded. Some days I think about letting it go wild. Then I remember how she'd sit out here in the evenings, planning where each new flower would go. Can't bring myself to stop hearing her voice in my head, telling me the yarrow needs dividing or the phlox wants more sun. Eleanor reached out, hesitated, then gently laid her hand over his. She gave you something beautiful to keep. He looked down at their hands, aged now but still familiar in their own way. She did, he agreed quietly. Then, with a slight clearing of his throat, of course she'd probably laugh herself silly seeing me fuss over flower beds like this. Used to tease me about being the only farmer in 3 counties who could tell you the Latin names for his weeds. The moment lightened, and Eleanor found herself smiling. I remember you knew all the wildflowers even back in high school. Used to drive your father crazy when you'd stop plowing to rescue prairie gentians. Still do, Thomas admitted with a small grin. Some habits die hard. A breath of wind stirred the garden, sending petals drifting around them like confetti. Eleanor watched them fall, thinking about time and change, and how some things endure despite both. She thought about the girl she'd been, so desperate to prove herself to the world, and the man beside her who'd found his own kind of proof in this land and the love he'd grown here. You know, she said carefully, I always wondered if you'd stayed rooted here because you were afraid of change. I'm beginning to think maybe you just understood something about depth that I was too busy looking at horizons to see. Thomas turned to look at her fully then, his eyes the same clear blue they'd been at 17. We all find our way home eventually, he said. Some of us just take the long way round. Before Eleanor could respond, a dinner bell rang from the direction of the house. Thomas stood, offering her his hand with the natural courtesy she remembered. That'll be May Wilson from next door. Always brings over a casserole when she spots. A car she doesn't recognize in my drive. Probably been dying of curiosity since last night. Eleanor accepted his help up, noting how naturally their hands still fit together. Should I be prepared for an inquisition? May's subtle as a tornado, Thomas chuckled. But she makes the best sweet potato pie in the county, so we put up with her questions. As they walked back toward the house, Eleanor cast one last look at the garden. In the golden hour light, it seemed to glow from within, a testament to love's ability to bloom in unexpected places. She wondered what Sarah would think, seeing her widowed husband walking through her flowers with his first love. Somehow, Eleanor suspected she might be smiling. The next morning's peace was broken by the sharp trill of a cell phone. Thomas, already on his 2nd cup of coffee, watched as Eleanor excused herself from the breakfast table, her voice shifting into something entirely different from the warm tones she'd used moments before while praising his homemade biscuits. Wilson speaking, she said, stepping onto the porch. Even through the screen door, her transformation was evident. The Singapore merger? No, absolutely not. Tell Chen we won't accept anything less than a controlling interest. Yes, I understand. It's 3 in the morning there. That's why we pay you what we do, James. Thomas busied himself with the dishes, trying not to eavesdrop, but finding it impossible not to hear snippets of negotiations and figures that made his yearly farm income seem like pocket change. Eleanor paced the porch, her silk scarf catching the morning light as she moved. I don't care what the board thinks, she continued, authority ringing in every word. I built this company from the ground up, and I won't see 30 years of work compromised because someone's nervous about the Asian markets. No, that's final. Call me when the papers are ready. The screen door creaked as she came back inside, looking apologetic. I'm sorry about that. Business never seems to sleep. Thomas nodded, drying his hands on a dish towel. Sounds important. Just the usual corporate drama, she said dismissively, but something in her eyes had changed. A wall had gone up, as if she'd suddenly remembered who she was supposed to be. Later that morning, while Eleanor took another call in the guest room, Thomas drove into town for supplies. May Wilson was waiting for him at the general store, practically vibrating with excitement. "Thomas Reeves, you won't believe what I just found." She thrust a copy of Forbes magazine into his hands, opened to a dog-eared page. "I knew she looked familiar. That woman staying with you, she's Eleanor Wilson, the silent billionaire." Thomas stared at the glossy page. There was Eleanor, photographed against a Manhattan skyline, wearing a suit that probably cost more than his tractor. The headline read, "The Silent Billionaire: How Eleanor Wilson Built a Global Empire Without Making Headlines." His eyes skimmed. The article started with a single investment in tech, revolutionary approach to sustainable development. Estimated net worth of $4.2 billion, famously private about her personal life, never married, rumors of a lost love in her hometown. Can you believe it? May was still talking. A real billionaire, right here in Prairie Grove, and staying at your farm of all places. Though, she lowered her voice conspiratorially, I did hear some stories from my mother about you two back in high school. Thomas carefully closed the magazine. "Need to get my feed loaded, May," he said quietly, handing it back to her. "But Thomas, feed won't load itself," he repeated firmly, turning toward the counter. The drive back to the farm was longer than usual, his mind crowded with calculations he'd never bothered to make before. Every decimal point of Eleanor's wealth seemed to add another mile between them. He thought about his worn boots, the patched knees of his work jeans, the simple life he'd built here. What could he possibly offer someone who could buy half the county without blinking? When he pulled up to the house, Eleanor was sitting on the porch steps, her laptop balanced on her, in knees. She looked up as he parked, and for a moment he saw her as the world did, powerful, untouchable, far beyond his rural reach. "I was thinking of making lunch," she said, closing her computer. "I remember you saying something about tomatoes from your garden." The normality of the question caught him off guard. "Eleanor," he started, then stopped, unsure how to continue. She must have read something in his face because her expression changed. "You know, don't you, about my company?" "Found out in town," he admitted. "May had a magazine." "Ah." Eleanor set her laptop aside. "I wondered when that would come up. I'm sorry I didn't tell you outright. I wanted a few days of being Eleanor Williams again, not Eleanor Wilson, CEO. Thomas leaned against his truck, feeling the warm metal through his shirt. $4 billion, he said, testing the words. "Give or take a few $100 million, she replied with a slight smile, though her eyes were serious. "Does it matter?" He looked out over his fields, the soybeans rippling in the breeze like a green ocean. "Might have been nice to know I was serving instant coffee to someone who could buy Colombia's entire coffee crop." "Thomas." She stood, walking toward him with that same grace he remembered from their youth, though now it was polished by decades of boardroom confidence. "I've had personal chefs make me coffee in 5 different countries. None of them ever made it taste like home the way yours does." The simple honesty in her voice made him look at her, really look at her. Past the designer clothes and carefully maintained appearance, he saw the girl who'd once helped him muck out stalls without complaint, who'd understood the poetry and freshly turned earth and seeds pushing toward the sun. "Still," he said, "must be quite a change from what you're used to." Eleanor reached out, brushing some dust from his shirt sleeve with familiar ease. "You know what I've gotten used to? Penthouse views I'm too busy to enjoy. Meals at restaurants, where the waiters judge you if you pronounce the wine wrong. People who smile at my face while calculating what they can get from me." She let her hand rest on his arm. This is real. "Do you know how long it's been since anyone cared more about my biscuit preferences than my stock preferences?" A wheat truck rumbled past on the distant road, raising a dust cloud that caught the sunlight like gold. Thomas found himself chuckling. Despite everything, Well, those biscuits are my mother's recipe, worth more than money, if you ask me. See? Eleanor's smile reached her eyes now. That's exactly what I mean. Though, she added with a hint of her old mischief, I should warn you that I did have my assistant wire a repair service to expedite fixing my car. Old habits die hard. Thomas shook his head, but he was smiling too. Suppose we've both changed some. Still like your eggs over easy, though. Some things, Eleanor said softly, are worth keeping the same. The Prairie Grove Harvest Festival had been a town tradition for over 70 years. Thomas hadn't planned on attending this year, hadn't gone since Sarah passed, but Eleanor's car repairs were taking longer than expected, and May Wilson had made it her personal mission to ensure they both appeared. You can't miss the festival, she'd insisted earlier that day, dropping off yet another casserole. Everyone's dying to meet your guest. The pause had been deliberate, heavy with unasked questions. Now, as they walked through the town square together, Thomas was acutely aware of the stares and whispers following them. Eleanor had somehow produced a casual dress that probably cost more than his monthly mortgage, but she wore it with an ease that made it seem natural among the denim and gingham surrounding them. The carnival lights still look the same, she observed, smiling at the colored bulbs strung between the old oak trees. Remember how they used to reflect in the fountain? Before Thomas could answer, Pete Myers appeared before them, his face flushed with excitement. Eleanor Williams, or should I say Ms. Wilson? I can't believe it's really you. Hello, Pete, Eleanor said warmly. I hear your son's studying agricultural science. Thomas tells me he's a great help on the farm. Pete beamed, but Thomas noticed how quickly the crowd was growing around them, familiar faces from his daily life, all straining to get a look at the local girl-turned-billionaire. Eleanor handled it with practiced grace, answering questions about her success while somehow deflecting the more personal inquiries. Let's get some cider, Thomas suggested finally, seeing the slight tension in her shoulders. She shot him a grateful look as he led her toward the refreshment stands. They found a quiet spot near the old bandstand where a local group was setting up their equipment. The evening air was sweet, with the scent of caramel apples and late summer flowers. Look what I found, Eleanor said, nodding toward an ancient record player set up near the band. They still use it for the traditional first dance. Thomas felt his chest tighten. The same player had been used at every harvest festival since they were teenagers, including that last dance in 1973, when they'd swayed together under these same trees, neither admitting it was goodbye. The band started playing, a cover of an old song that made several couples move toward the dance area. Eleanor's fingers tapped lightly against her cider cup in rhythm. Mrs. Peterson still teaches dance at the community center, Thomas said, surprising himself. Says it keeps her young. Some things never change, Eleanor murmured, then turned to face him fully. Dance with me? The question hung between them, weighted with decades of history. Thomas looked at her extended hand, remembering calloused teenage palms and summer romance. Now her fingers were manicured, and his were roughened by years of farm work. But when they came together, the fit was still perfect. He led her to the edge of the dance area, aware of the eyes following them, but finding it harder to care. The band shifted into a slower song. Moon River, he realized with a start. Their song, from that last festival so long ago. They remember, Eleanor whispered as they began to move together. Small towns never forget, he replied softly. They danced in comfortable silence, their steps falling into familiar patterns. Eleanor's perfume mixed with the evening air, something expensive and subtle, so different from the drugstore scents of their youth. Yet underneath, he caught the same warmth he remembered. I looked for this song, she admitted after a while, her voice low enough that only he could hear. In every city, every success celebration, it never sounded right without the cricket singing backup. Thomas pulled her slightly closer, feeling the years between them dissolve like morning mist. Missed you at the festivals, he said simply. Every year, she rested her head against his shoulder, a gesture so natural it made his heart ache. I missed you too, more than I let myself admit." Around them, the festival continued its cheerful bustle. Children ran past with painted faces, sparklers leaving light trails in the growing dusk. The smell of funnel cakes and grilled corn drifted on the breeze, mingling with the sound of laughter and conversation. "Your world is so much bigger now," Thomas said, watching the festival lights reflect in her eyes. Eleanor lifted her head to look at him. Different maybe, not better. She glanced around at the familiar faces, the simple celebrations. "You know, I've attended galas where the chandelier cost more than most houses, but I've never felt more like myself than right here, dancing to a scratchy record player under string lights." The song ended, but they stayed swaying slightly, neither quite ready to let go. Finally, Thomas stepped back, keeping hold of her hand. "Want to see if Mabel's still making her blue ribbon apple butter?" Eleanor's smile was radiant. "Only if you'll share a funnel cake with me after, for old time's sake." They moved through the festival together, sampling treats and greeting old friends. Thomas watched as Eleanor charmed his neighbors, noting how she remembered names and old connections, asking about children and grandchildren. She might be a billionaire CEO, but here tonight she was just Eleanor Williams again, the girl who'd once known every family in Prairie Grove. As the evening wound down, they found themselves back near the fountain. The water caught the festival, lights sending colored ripples dancing across their faces. "Thank you," Eleanor said suddenly. "For what?" "For dancing with me. For showing me that home isn't just a place you leave behind." She touched his arm lightly. "For reminding me who I used to be." Above them, the first stars were appearing in the darkening sky, and somewhere in the distance, a lone cicada started its evening song. The morning after the festival, Thomas found himself in the attic, searching for an old repair manual he thought might help with Eleanor's car. The space was thick with dust and memories, illuminated by thin shafts of sunlight that cut through the gloom. He'd avoided coming up here since Sarah passed. Too many boxes of carefully preserved moments he wasn't ready to face. As he moved aside a stack of yellowed newspapers, his hand brushed against a familiar wooden box. His mother's old recipe box, the one Sarah had used to store important papers. Something made him pause, lift the lid. Inside, beneath a stack of warranty cards and old seed catalogues, he found an envelope he'd never seen before. The paper had aged to a soft yellow, but he recognized the handwriting immediately. Eleanor's neat script spelled out his name and the farm's address, followed by a postmark from 1973. The envelope was sealed, never sent. "Thomas?" Eleanor's voice drifted up from below. May called about the car parts. Her footsteps on the attic stairs trailed off as she reached the top and saw what he was holding. The dust motes swirled between them in the morning light. "That's..." She moved closer, her designer clothes incongruous among the cobwebs and old furniture. "I wrote that the week after I left." Thomas held the envelope carefully, as if it might crumble to dust in his hands. "Sarah must have found it when she was helping my mother clean out her things. Never showed it to me." Eleanor's hand trembled slightly as she reached for the letter. "I drove back, you know, a week after I'd gone, sat in my car at the end of your driveway for hours, trying to find the courage to give you this." She swallowed hard. "Your father was in the fields that day. I watched him working and thought about how you'd be out there too someday, carrying on the legacy. I couldn't be the one to pull you away from that." Thomas looked at the envelope. "Still sealed after all these years. What does it say?" "The truth," Eleanor whispered, "that I was terrified. Not of failing at business school. I knew I could handle that. I was terrified of succeeding, of building something so big it would pull us both away from here, of asking you to choose between your dreams and mine." She took a shaky breath. "It says that I loved you enough to leave, that sometimes love means letting go, even when it breaks your heart, that I hoped someday you'd understand why I couldn't ask you to wait." Thomas turned the envelope over in his hands, feeling the weight of unspoken words. "I would have waited," he said quietly. "I know." Eleanor's voice was thick with emotion. That's exactly why I couldn't ask you to. You would have put your life on hold, torn between the farm and whatever city my ambitions took me to. It wouldn't have been fair. Life's rarely fair, Thomas observed, thinking of Sarah, of all the twists and turns that had brought them to this dusty attic decades later. Eleanor reached out, her fingers brushing his as she touched the envelope. Should we open it? The question hung in the air between them. Thomas studied the sealed letter, thinking about the girl who'd written it, about the woman standing before him now, about all the years of wondering that lay between those two versions of Eleanor. No, he said finally. Some things are better. Left in the past. We're different people now. Eleanor's eyes met his, understanding flowing between them. Are we? Different enough that it matters? Before he could answer, a floorboard creaked beneath them, and they both started. The spell of the moment cracked, letting in the present with all its complications. The car parts, Thomas remembered, setting the letter carefully back in the box. Right, Eleanor said, smoothing her skirt. May says they've arrived at the garage in town. They made their way down the attic stairs in silence, each lost in thought. At the bottom, Eleanor paused, looking back up at where the recipe box sat among the shadows. You know what the hardest part was? She said softly. Not writing the letter. Not even driving away that day. The hardest part was convincing myself, year after year, that I'd made the right choice, that success filled the space I left behind. Thomas watched her profile in the morning light streaming through. The hallway window. Did it? It filled everything except the important parts. She turned to face him fully. I built an empire, Thomas. Changed the way sustainable development works in 3 continents. But some nights, sitting in my penthouse office looking out over the city lights, all I could think about was the way sunset looks over your south field. The confession hung between them, heavy with implications. Thomas thought about the letter upstairs, about all the words they'd left unsaid over the years, about how time had a way of bringing things full circle. Sunset's still the same, he said quietly. Southfield's still there. Eleanor's smile was soft, touched with something that looked like hope. Some things never change, some things aren't meant to. The peace of the farm shattered early the next morning with the aggressive buzz of Eleanor's phone. Thomas, already up and making coffee, watched her transform in an instant from peaceful sleep to corporate warrior as she answered the call. What? Do you mean hostile takeover? Her voice carried from the guest room, sharp with authority. Jenkins promised us. I see. No, wake up the London team. I don't care what time it is there. She emerged from the room, already dressed in a crisp business suit, her laptop clutched in one hand. The contrast between her corporate armor and his worn kitchen was stark. I need to set up a virtual command center, she said, scanning the room. Is there anywhere with reliable internet? Thomas gestured to Sarah's old sewing room, now his. Makeshift office. Pete's boy helped me set up high speed last year for the farm accounts. The next few hours were a blur of activity. Eleanor commandeered his desk, transforming the simple space into what looked like a war room. Her laptop projected spreadsheets onto the wall while she conducted rapid-fire video conferences with people across multiple time zones. Thomas brought her coffee, then lunch, both of which grew cold, untouched. They're trying to undermine everything. I've built, she explained during a brief break, rubbing her temples. A consortium of competitors thinks they can force a merger by driving our stock price down. She glanced at her phone, grimacing. It's down 12% already. Thomas sat in Sarah's old rocking chair, feeling out of his depth. Sounds complicated. Eleanor's laugh held no humor. That's putting it mildly. I've spent 30 years building this company, making sure we prioritize sustainable development and fair labor practices. These vultures would dismantle all of that for quick profits. She turned back to her laptop, then paused. I'm sorry, this must seem like a different world to you. It is, Thomas admitted. But I understand protecting what you've built. He looked out the window at his fields. Had to fight off developers myself a few years back. Wanted to turn the South Field into a strip mall. Eleanor's fingers stilled on her keyboard. How did you handle it? Same way I handle everything. One day at a time, staying true to what matters. He stood, moving to the window. See that line of trees at the edge of the property? My grandfather planted those as a windbreak during the Dust Bowl. Said sometimes the best way to fight is to put down deeper roots. A notification pinged on Eleanor's laptop, but for the first time that day, she didn't immediately respond. Instead, she joined him at the window, their shoulders nearly touching as they looked out over the farm. I've forgotten that kind of wisdom, she said softly. In my world, everything's about speed, quarterly reports, instant reactions. Sometimes I feel like I'm running so fast I can't remember what I'm running toward. Before Thomas could respond, her phone buzzed again. This time the number made her pale slightly. I have to take this, she said. It's the board chairman. Thomas nodded, heading for the door. I'll be in the barn if you need anything. He spent the next hour fixing a broken tractor part, trying not to think about the billions of dollars being discussed just a few 100 feet away. The rhythmic work of his hands on familiar metal helped center him, but he couldn't shake the image of Eleanor's face when she'd looked out over his fields. Tired, yes, but something else too. Longing, maybe. The sound of heels on gravel made him look up. Eleanor stood in the barn doorway, backlit by the afternoon sun. Her suit was still pristine, but her eyes held a fierce gleam he remembered from their youth. I just bought 3 of my competitors, she announced. Thomas wiped his hands on a rag. That sounds significant. It is. She stepped into the barn, seemingly unconcerned about the dust on her designer shoes. I used my personal funds. The board thought I wouldn't risk my own fortune to protect the company's integrity. A smile played at her lips. They forgot who they were dealing with. The girl who once organized a protest to save the old oak tree in front of the school, Thomas remembered. Never did back down from a fight. Some things don't change. Eleanor looked around the barn, her expression softening. You know what made me decide? I was watching you out here, working with your hands, knowing exactly why you do what you do, and I realized I'd lost sight of my own why. She touched a weathered support beam. This hostile takeover made me see what really matters. Not the stock price or the board's approval, but the thousands of people who depend on my company doing the right thing. Thomas studied her face, seeing both the powerful CEO and the passionate teenager she'd been. Sounds like you found your roots again. Maybe I needed to come back here to remember what they felt like. She moved closer, close enough that he could smell her expensive perfume, mixing with the barn's honest sense of hay and earth. Thank you. For what? Didn't do anything but stay out of your way. Eleanor shook her head. You showed me what it looks like when someone knows their true north. I'd forgotten that there are some things money can't buy and shouldn't try to. A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the soft sounds of wind chimes Sarah had hung years ago. Thomas thought about the Eleanor he'd known, the one who'd left to chase her dreams, and this woman who'd achieved them all only to find herself looking back toward home. Your car parts came in, he said finally. Garage. Called while you were on your video thing. Oh, Eleanor blinked, as if she'd forgotten about her broken-down car entirely. I suppose I should arrange to have it fixed. Neither of them moved. Course, Thomas added carefully. Harvest season's coming up. Could use an extra pair of hands if you're not in a hurry to get back. The smile that spread across Eleanor's face was pure sunrise. I do have several weeks of vacation saved up. Perks of being the boss. She glanced down at her suit. Though I may need to revise my wardrobe choices. Still got your old overalls in the attic somewhere, Thomas offered. And they both laughed, the sound echoing in the barn like memory-given voice. The storm rolled in without warning, the kind of late summer tempest that could flatten corn and flood creeks within hours. Thomas and Eleanor barely made it back to the house from the fields, rain soaking them despite their run from the barn. Thunder cracked overhead as they stumbled through the kitchen door, breathless and dripping. Just like old times, Eleanor laughed, wringing water from her hair. She'd traded her business suits for borrowed overalls, and now they clung to her. Like a second skin. Remember that storm in junior year, the one that trapped us in the Andersons' barn? Your father was ready to skin me alive, Thomas recalled, reaching for a stack of towels. The power flickered ominously as another thunderclap shook the windows. Better get the emergency lamp. Storm like this, we'll likely lose electricity. As if on cue, the lights went out. In the sudden darkness, they could hear the rain hammering against the roof, the wind howling through the eaves. Thomas found his way to the cabinet by memory, retrieving an old oil lamp, the same one his father had used, and his father before him. The lamp's warm glow filled the kitchen, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Eleanor had found her way to the window seat, tucking her legs beneath her as she watched the storm rage. She looked younger in the soft light, more like the girl who'd once dreamed beside him than the corporate titan she'd become. "We should probably change into dry clothes," Thomas said, but neither of them moved. Something about the storm's isolation, the way it cut them off from the outside world, made the moment feel suspended in time. "Do you ever wonder," Eleanor asked suddenly, her eyes still on the rain-lashed windows, "what would have happened if I'd stayed?" The question hung in the lamplit air between them. Thomas settled into his usual chair, considering his answer. Carefully, used to, every day for a long time. And now? Now I think maybe we both needed to become who we are. He watched the lamp flame flicker. You needed to build your empire. I needed to build this life with Sarah. Some paths you can't see the sense of until you've walked them all the way. Eleanor turned from the window to look at him. I saw you, you know. Over the years, articles about sustainable farming practices, in agricultural journals, that piece in the Midwest Farmer about your organic certification. A small smile played at her lips. I had a subscription. Kept tabs on me, did you? I told myself it was professional interest, that knowing about farming trends was important for my development projects. She traced a pattern in the condensation, on the window, but really I just needed to know you were okay, that you'd found your way. A particularly bright flash of lightning illuminated the kitchen, followed almost immediately by a deafening crack of thunder. Eleanor jumped slightly, and Thomas found himself moving to join her on the window seat, an old instinct to comfort rising naturally. I did find my way, he said softly. Had help, though. Sarah, he paused, gathering his thoughts. She knew about you from the start. Used to tease me about how I'd perk up whenever the business news mentioned your company. Said I had two great loves in my life, the farm and the memory of you, and she was content being the caretaker of both. Eleanor's breath caught audibly. She sounds remarkable. She was. Think you would have liked each other, actually. She had your kind of strength, different flavor, but same core. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the storm transform the familiar landscape into something wild and mysterious. The old photo album they'd discovered while looking for flashlights lay unopened between them. May I? Eleanor asked, gesturing to the album. Thomas nodded, and she opened it carefully, the leather crackling softly. The first photo made them both catch their breath. The Prairie Grove High School senior class picnic, 1973. There they were, sitting on the hood of Thomas's father's truck, young and impossibly bright with promise. Eleanor's hair was long then, catching the sun, and Thomas still had that cowlick that wouldn't lie flat, no matter what. Look how young we were, Eleanor murmured. So sure we had it all figured out. Still got that cowlick, Thomas admitted, running a hand through his silver hair. Some battles you just learn to lose gracefully. Eleanor laughed, then sobered as she turned the page. Oh, she said softly. There was Sarah, radiant in her wedding dress, looking at Thomas with such clear love it made the heart ache. She was beautiful, inside and out, Thomas agreed. Always said marriage was about growing together, not just growing old together. Taught me more about love than I ever knew existed. Like what? Like how it's not just one thing, not just romance or passion or comfort, it's choice. Every day, choosing to water what you've planted, even when the weather turns harsh. He glanced at her. Bit like farming that way. Lightning flashed again, but the thunder was more distant now, the storm moving on. Eleanor closed the album gently, but kept her hand resting on its worn cover. "I made my choice," she said quietly. "Walked away because I thought that's what love meant. Setting you free to have the life you were meant for. Spent decades building something I thought would justify that choice." She looked up at him, her eyes bright in the lamplight. "Never quite managed to convince myself, though." Thomas covered her hand with his own, feeling the years between them like layers of soil, rich with what had grown there. Maybe some choices don't need justifying. Maybe they just need understanding. Outside, the rain began to soften, turning from violent drumming to gentle percussion. The familiar scents of the house, old wood, fresh bread, lingering coffee, mingled with the storm fresh air seeping through window frames that had never quite sealed properly. "We should check for damage once it clears," Thomas said, but he didn't move his hand from hers. "Yes," Eleanor agreed softly. "We should." Neither of them moved until long after the storm had passed, content to sit in the lamp's warm glow, letting the years settle between them like silt after a flood, making the ground more fertile for whatever might grow next. The morning after the storm dawned clear and fresh, the air scrubbed clean by rain. Thomas rose early as usual, but instead of heading straight to the fields, he found himself drawn to Sarah's side of the closet. He'd kept everything just as she'd left it, her clothes still hanging neatly, her collection of scarves draped over hangers, her small wooden chest of keepsakes tucked in the corner. The chest had remained closed since her passing, but something about the previous nights. Conversations with Eleanor stirred an urge to open it. Inside, nestled among photographs and pressed flowers, lay Sarah's last diary, its leather cover soft with use. "I thought I might find you here." Eleanor's voice came softly from the doorway. She was already dressed in work clothes, ready for another day of helping with the harvest preparations. "Bad memories?" Thomas shook his head, running his fingers over the diary's spine. "Good ones, just hard sometimes." Eleanor moved to sit beside him on the bed, careful to maintain a respectful distance. "Tell me about her. The real her, not just the wonderful woman everyone describes." Thomas opened the diary, a pressed wildflower falling from between its pages. "She loved morning glories. Said they reminded her that beauty doesn't have to last forever to matter." He smiled faintly. "Used to drive me crazy, the way she'd stop working to watch them close up each afternoon." He flipped through the pages, Sarah's familiar handwriting, flowing across them like a conversation from the past. Then a passage caught his eye, dated 3 months before she died. "Thomas brought me to the wildflower garden today. My legs aren't working so well anymore, but he carried me to our bench, and we watched the sunset together. He tries so hard to be strong, my farmer with his careful hands and tender heart. I worry about him, about the loneliness that's coming. He has so much love still to give." Eleanor remained silent as Thomas turned to another entry. "Had a dream about Eleanor Williams last night. Funny how the heart knows things we don't let ourselves admit. I've always known she was Thomas's first real love, seen it in the way he lights up when her company makes the news, in how he keeps that old class photo tucked in his wallet. I've never been jealous. Love isn't a finite resource. It grows like his crops, multiplying when properly tended. I hope when I'm gone, he remembers that." Thomas's hands trembled slightly as he read the final entry, dated just a week before she passed. "My dearest Thomas, if you're reading this, and I know you will eventually, please know that loving again won't dishonor what we shared. Our love story was beautiful, but it doesn't have to be your last. You have too much heart to let it go fallow. Whether it's Eleanor or someone else, don't be afraid to plant new seeds of joy. I'll be watching our wildflowers grow from wherever I am, smiling at your happiness." A warm tear splashed onto the page, and Thomas quickly closed the diary. Eleanor's hand found his shoulder, squeezed gently. "She knew," Thomas said hoarsely. "All those years, she knew about you, about everything." "Of course she did." Eleanor replied softly. Good wives always know their husbands' hearts. The wise ones understand that past love doesn't diminish present love. Thomas stood abruptly, moving to the window. The morning sun sparkled on dew-drenched fields, painting the world in shades of promise. Been feeling guilty, he admitted, these past few days, having you here, feeling things I thought were long buried. Thomas. Eleanor's voice was gentle but firm. Sarah's giving you permission to be happy. That's a rare and precious gift. He turned to face her, seeing the morning light catch the silver in her hair. Doesn't feel right. How easy it is to talk to you. How natural it feels, having you here. Maybe that's exactly why it is right. Eleanor stood, moving to join him at the window. Sarah understood something I'm just learning. Love doesn't divide when you share it. It multiplies. Thomas looked down at the diary in his hands, then at the woman beside him, the girl he'd first loved, now grown into someone both familiar and new. Sarah used to say that too, about love multiplying. Smart woman, Eleanor murmured. I wish I'd known her. She knew you, Thomas replied softly. Through me, through all the stories I couldn't help but tell. She used to joke that she felt like she had a sister-in-law she'd never met. Eleanor's laugh was warm, but her eyes were bright with unshed tears. Thank you for sharing this with me, she said, gesturing to the diary. I know it couldn't have been easy. Thomas carefully placed the diary back in Sarah's chest, alongside the pressed flowers and photographs. She would have wanted you to know, to understand. He paused, then added, to not feel guilty either. Their eyes met. Decades of unspoken feelings flowing between them like a quiet stream. Eleanor reached out, her fingers just brushing his. No guilt, she agreed. Just gratitude for what was, what is, and what might be. Outside, morning glories were opening their faces to the sun, their brief beauty made more precious by its impermanence. Thomas thought about Sarah's words, about love multiplying, about fields lying fallow until new seeds found their way home. Breakfast, he offered, his voice rough with emotion. Think we still have some of those blackberries you picked yesterday? Eleanor's smile was gentle with understanding. Breakfast sounds perfect. Then you can show me how to work that ancient tractor of yours. As they headed downstairs, Thomas felt lighter somehow, as if Sarah's words had given him permission to breathe fully again. The diary's revelations settled into his heart like rain into thirsty soil, promising new growth. The certified letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, its official envelope stark against the usual pile of seed catalogues and farm bulletins. Thomas recognized the law firm's name from previous correspondence, and his stomach tightened as he opened it at the kitchen table. Eleanor was washing breakfast dishes, humming softly, a habit she'd developed over the past week of domestic routine. She turned when she heard his sharp intake of breath. Thomas, what is it? He read the letter twice before answering. Remember, those developers I mentioned, the ones who wanted the South Field. He passed her the letter, watching her expression shift from concern to focused concentration. Seems they've found a way around the agricultural preservation laws. Eleanor scanned the document, her CEO persona emerging like a shield. Watershed rezoning application, environmental impact survey. They're trying to claim the land is more valuable as a commercial water management area than farmland. Her eyes narrowed. This is clever, underhanded but clever. Pete's boy, the one studying agricultural science, he explained it to me. Something about how they can override farming protections if they prove the land would better serve the community as water management infrastructure. Thomas stood, moving to the window that overlooked the threatened field. They're offering 3 times market value. But it's not about the money, is it? Eleanor set the letter down, coming to stand beside him. That field's been in my family for 4 generations. My grandfather survived the Dust Bowl farming it. My father taught me to drive a tractor on it. He pressed his palm against the cool glass. Sarah and I planted our first crop there together. Eleanor was quiet for a moment, then asked carefully, Would you like me to have my legal team look at this? Thomas turned to face her. Already involving yourself in one fight this week. Your company is fine, she interrupted. I have plenty of resources to handle both situations. She touched his arm gently. Let me help, Thomas. He studied her face, seeing both the woman who wanted to help and the powerful CEO who could. Wouldn't feel right using your influence like that. Why not? Those developers are using their influence, their lawyers, their money. She picked up the letter again. Besides, I know this firm. They often work for Vista Development Group. Her expression turned thoughtful. Interesting coincidence. Vista's CEO was one of the players in that hostile takeover attempt last week. Before Thomas could respond, his phone rang. It was May. Wilson, her voice urgent. Thomas, you need to turn on the news. Channel 5. They're talking about the farm. Eleanor found the remote for the small TV Sarah had insisted on keeping in the kitchen. The local news showed aerial footage of Prairie Grove Farm, focusing on the south field. Proposed water management facility would provide jobs and infrastructure support for the growing region, the reporter was saying. However, local farmers argue the project would disrupt generations of agricultural tradition. They've been planning this for months, Eleanor said quietly. The surveys, the media coverage, the legal groundwork. They're not just after your field, Thomas. They want to set a precedent for the whole region. Thomas sank into a kitchen chair, feeling the weight of legacy on his shoulders. Sarah always said that field had the best soil in the county. Something about the way the rain runs down from the hills, carrying minerals. He looked up at Eleanor. Can't bear the thought of seeing it covered in concrete. Eleanor's expression shifted, and Thomas recognized the look she got when formulating business strategies. Give me an hour, she said, reaching for her laptop. I need to make some calls. She disappeared into Sarah's sewing room, and soon Thomas could hear her voice taking on that tone of authority he'd witnessed during her company crisis. He busied himself with farm chores, trying not to think about bulldozers and rezoning laws. When Eleanor emerged 3 hours later, her face was flushed with triumph. Check your email. Thomas opened his ancient laptop, finding a message from his bank. His eyes widened as he read. Eleanor, what did you do? I bought the development rights, she said simply. Not just for your field, but for all the agricultural land in the watershed, through my personal holdings, not the company. She sat across from him. The developers can't touch it now. None of them can. Thomas stared at her, emotions warring in his chest. That must have cost a fraction of what I made blocking that hostile takeover. She reached across the table, taking his hand. Before you protest about not wanting charity, think of it as an investment. In sustainable agriculture, in the community, she hesitated. In us. Us? Thomas's heart did a strange flutter. I'm not trying to buy my way back into your life, Thomas, but I do want to protect what matters to you. She squeezed his hand. Consider it my way of putting down roots again. He looked down at their joined hands, weathered and worn, but still fitting together perfectly. You didn't have to do this. No, she agreed, but I wanted to. That field out there, it's not just soil and crops, it's stories and memories and hope for the future. Sometimes the best business decisions aren't about business at all. Thomas stood, drawing her up with him, and together they walked to the window. The south field stretched before them, golden with late summer light, alive with possibility. Thank you, he said simply, and felt her lean against him slightly. You know, she mused, that field could do amazing things with some of the sustainable farming techniques my company's been developing. If you're interested. Thomas smiled, hearing the careful hope in her voice. Might be. Got a pretty good agricultural consultant right here, seems like. Eleanor's laughter was warm against his shoulder. We always did work well together. Outside, the threatened field waved gently in the breeze, unaware it had just been saved by the very thing that had once pulled them apart. Eleanor's business acumen and determination. Thomas thought about cycles and seasons, about how sometimes you had to let things go so they could come back stronger. The harvest moon hung low and golden over the fields, so bright it cast shadows nearly as sharp as day. Thomas and Eleanor worked side by side in its light, racing against a weather forecast that promised rain by morning. They weren't alone. Word had spread through Prairie Grove's farming community that Thomas Reeves needed help bringing in his soybeans before the storm, and neighbors had appeared throughout the evening with extra hands and equipment. "Just like the old days," Pete Myers called from his combine. "Remember when the whole town would turn out for harvest?" Eleanor wiped sweat from her forehead, her borrowed work clothes now properly dirty. "Remember when your father would bring that huge cooler of lemonade?" "Still does," Pete's wife Janet shouted from where she was directing trucks, "though these days he spikes it." Laughter rippled across the field, mixing with the rumble of machinery and the chirp of crickets. Thomas watched Eleanor pitch in alongside, people she hadn't seen in decades, calling out greetings and trading memories as if she'd never left. The elegant CEO was completely hidden beneath dust and determination. Around midnight they paused for a brief rest. Thomas found Eleanor sitting on the tailgate of his truck, sharing a thermos of coffee with May Wilson's daughter. "Here," he said, offering her his red bandana. "Got something for that dust." Eleanor took it with a smile. "My board of directors would have a collective heart attack if they could see me now." "Oh, I don't know about that," May's daughter grinned. "Forbes magazine would probably love a story about a billionaire CEO getting her hands dirty with real farming." "No press," Eleanor and Thomas said simultaneously, then caught each other's eyes and laughed. The moment was interrupted by Pete's boy Danny, running up with urgency in his steps. "Mr. Reeves, the old combine's acting up again, making that noise you were worried about." Thomas sighed. They needed every piece of equipment running to finish before the rain. "Better take a look." "I'll come with you," Eleanor said, surprising. "Him?" At his raised eyebrow she added, "What? I used to help you fix engines all the time, unless you think I've gotten too corporate to remember which end of a wrench is which." Under the harvest moon's light, they worked on the combine together, their hands meeting occasionally as they passed tools back and forth. The familiar task brought back memories of similar nights in their youth, working on his father's old tractor, while dreaming about their futures. "Remember that summer night when the thresher broke down?" Eleanor asked, her voice muffled as she reached deep into the engine. "Your father was so worried about losing the wheat crop, and you figured out—" "It was just a loose belt," Thomas nodded. "Dad said then that I should marry you just for your mechanical sense." Eleanor emerged from the engine, a smudge of grease on her cheek. "He never did understand why I wanted to fix companies instead of machines." "Think I understand now," Thomas said quietly. "Seeing you handle that takeover attempt, saving the South Field, you've got a gift for fixing broken things, no matter what size they are." Their eyes met in the moonlight, the air between them charged with something more than just memories. Eleanor opened her mouth to respond, but just then the combine's engine turned over with a healthy rumble. "Would you look at that?" she smiled. "Still got it." They worked through the night, the community coming together in that timeless way. Of farming towns, young Danny kept everyone supplied with coffee from a huge thermos, while Janet Myers organized the loading and transport of the harvested crops with military precision. As the moon began to set, painting the world in silver and shadow, Thomas found himself working beside Eleanor in comfortable silence. She matched him row for row, her movements efficient despite her obvious fatigue. "You didn't have to stay." "Out all night," he said softly. "Pretty far cry from your penthouse." Eleanor paused, stretching her back. "You know what I've missed most, living in the city? This feeling, being part of something bigger than yourself. Something real." She gestured at the community working around them. "In my world, alliances shift with stock prices. Out here, neighbors still show up with casseroles and combine harvesters." "Speaking of showing up," Thomas nodded toward the road, where more headlights were appearing. "Looks like the Anderson boys finally made it." The additional help arrived just as the first hint of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky. They finished the last row, just as thunder rumbled in the distance. "Perfect timing," Pete called out. Nothing like cutting it close. The community gathered in Thomas's yard as the first drops began to fall, sharing coffee and May's hastily baked cinnamon rolls. Eleanor stood slightly apart, watching the scene with an expression Thomas couldn't quite read. He joined her, offering a fresh cup of coffee. "Penny, for your thoughts?" "Just thinking about different kinds of wealth," she said softly. "I could buy and sell half the state, but I couldn't buy this." She gestured at the gathering. "This kind of community, this sense of belonging, it's worth more than anything. In my portfolio." Thomas studied her profile in the growing dawn light, seeing both the girl she'd been and the woman she'd become. "You still belong here," he said. Never stopped. Eleanor turned to him, her eyes bright with something that might have been tears or just reflection of the rising sun. "Do I? After all this time?" Before he could answer, the rain began in earnest, sending everyone scrambling for cover. In the chaos of goodbyes and thank yous, Thomas and Eleanor found themselves standing close together under the porch overhang, watching the rain wash over freshly harvested fields. "Thank you," Eleanor said suddenly, "for letting me be part of this." Thomas reached for her hand, finding it as natural as breathing. "Thank you for coming home." Morning light filtered through the kitchen windows as Thomas sorted through the mail that had accumulated during the harvest rush. Most were the usual farm-related items, but one glossy magazine caught his attention, Forbes' latest issue with Eleanor's face on the cover. The headline read, "Eleanor Wilson, the silent queen of sustainable development speaks out." His coffee grew cold as he read the article, each paragraph revealing a new layer of the woman he thought he'd come to know. Again, the Eleanor described in these pages was a titan of industry, a visionary who'd transformed agricultural practices across continents, a woman whose personal fortune could revitalize entire economies. "I was going to tell you," Eleanor's voice came from the doorway. She stood there in his borrowed workshirt, looking both powerful and vulnerable. "About everything." Thomas set the magazine down carefully. "Says here you own controlling interest in the largest sustainable agriculture corporation in the world." His voice was quiet. "That the development rights you bought for the Southfield were worth more than what most people earn in a lifetime." "Yes." She moved into the kitchen but didn't sit down. "I've spent 30 years building something I thought would make a difference. Change how the world thinks about farming, about sustainability." She paused. "About the things you taught me to care about." Thomas picked up the magazine again, focusing on a particular passage. "According to this, you've never married, never even been seriously linked to anyone." He looked up at her. "All these years, I thought you'd found someone else, built a life with them." Eleanor's hands gripped the back of a kitchen chair. "How could I? Every man I met, I compared to you, to your integrity, your connection to the land, your quiet strength." She laughed softly, but there was pain in it. "Do you know how hard it is to find someone who measures up to your first love?" The old bus ticket fell from between the magazines. Pages, the one they'd found in the attic that she'd never used to leave town all those years ago. Thomas picked it up, its edges worn with age. "You kept this," he said, "all these years. I keep it in my office desk. Whenever I have to make a difficult decision, I look at it." Her voice wavered slightly, "to remind myself of the biggest decision I ever made, and what it cost me." Thomas stood slowly, his farmer's instincts reading the storm brewing between them. "Why come back now? Why not tell me everything from the start?" "Because I needed to know if there was anything left of us beneath all the years and changes. If you could see me, just me, without the wealth and power clouding everything." She moved closer, close enough that he could see the tension in her shoulders. "I needed to know if Thomas Reeves still had room in his heart for Eleanor Williams, not Eleanor Wilson, the CEO. And now I'm terrified that I've ruined everything by keeping secrets. That you'll think these past weeks have been some kind of game." Her voice caught. "They haven't been, Thomas. Every moment here has been more real than the last 30 years of board meetings and business deals." Thomas walked to the window, looking out at his fields. Their fields now, he supposed, given her ownership of the development rights. The morning sun painted everything in shades of gold, making the dew sparkle like scattered diamonds. "Found something else in that magazine," he said finally. "A quote from you about why you focused on sustainable agriculture. You said it was because someone once taught you that true wealth grows from the ground up, not from the top down." "You taught me that," Eleanor whispered. "The summer before I left. We were sitting on your father's tractor, and you were explaining why you couldn't just plant the same crop year after year, how you had to understand the whole system, the soil, the weather, the cycles of life." Thomas turned back to her. "You built an empire on that lesson." "I built it for you," she admitted. "Every sustainable farming initiative, every rural development project, I always asked myself what you would think, whether it honored what you believed in." She straightened her shoulders. "I understand if you're angry, if this changes how you see me or what's been growing between us." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, studying the woman before him. Elegant even in borrowed work clothes, powerful even in her vulnerability. He thought about Sarah's words in her diary, about love multiplying rather than dividing. "You remember what my father used to say about judging crops?" he asked finally. Eleanor blinked at the apparent non sequitur. "That you can't judge a harvest by how green the leaves are?" "Have to look at the roots," Thomas nodded. "See what's growing underneath." He stepped closer to her. "These past weeks, I've seen your roots, Eleanor. Seen how that girl I loved grew into a woman who uses her power to protect what matters, who still knows how to fix a combine engine and bring in a harvest. And my secrets? Reckon we've all got those. Question is what grows from them." He reached out, touching her cheek gently. "You built something amazing, Eleanor. Not just your company. You built a way to make our old dreams about sustainable farming come true on a scale I never imagined." Tears spilled down her cheeks. "I never stopped loving you," she whispered. "Never stopped measuring every success against the simple joy of watching a sunset from your father's tractor." Thomas pulled her closer, feeling the years between them dissolve like morning mist. "Then maybe it's time to come home. Really home. No more secrets. No more separate worlds. How can it work? I have responsibilities, a company to run, and I have a farm to tend. But you've got that fancy laptop and the internet Pete's boy set up." He smiled slightly. "Maybe it's time we both learned some new ways of growing things." Eleanor's laugh was watery but real. A billionaire CEO running her empire from a farmhouse in Prairie Grove. "Stranger things have happened," Thomas said, softly, like first loves finding their way home after 30 years. The morning sun streamed through the windows, warming them both as they stood in his kitchen. Her kitchen too now, if she wanted it. Outside, the fields stretched endless and green, promising new growth, new harvests, new beginnings. The calls from Eleanor's office had been growing more insistent. Thomas could see it in the tension that crept into her shoulders each time her phone buzzed, in the late nights she spent on video conferences in Sarah's old sewing room. The outside world was reaching in, demanding her return. "The Singapore merger is at a critical stage," she explained one morning, watching him make breakfast. Her laptop was open on the kitchen table, dozens of unread emails flooding her inbox. "And the board is getting restless about my extended absence." Thomas set a plate of eggs in front of her, over easy, just as she'd always liked them. "When do you need to leave?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with everything they hadn't said. Eleanor pushed her eggs around the plate. "Not meeting his eyes? There's a company jet waiting at the regional airport. Has been for 3 days." "Of course there is," Thomas said softly, no judgment in his voice. "You've built something important. Can't just abandon it. Come with me." The words burst from her suddenly, surprising them both. "Just for a while. See my world, the way I've seen yours again these past weeks." Thomas looked around his kitchen, their kitchen as he'd begun to think of it. Through the window he could see the first hints of fall touching the maple trees, their leaves just starting to turn gold at the edges. "Farm needs tending," He said gently, "can't just walk away from the harvest season." "I know." Eleanor's voice was thick with understanding. "I know you can't leave, just like I can't stay." "Not completely." She stood, moving to the window. "We're right back where we were 30 years ago, aren't we? Torn between two worlds." Thomas joined her at the window, their shoulders barely touching. "Not exactly the same," he corrected. "We're not kids anymore, trying to figure out who we are. We know now. Question is whether who we've become can find a way to bridge the gap." Eleanor turned to face him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I don't want to lose you again." "Then don't." He reached into his pocket, pulling out 2 plane tickets. "Called your office yesterday. Spoke to your assistant, James. Nice fellow once he got over his shock at a farmer calling the CEO's private line." Eleanor stared at the tickets. "Thomas? One's for you, heading back to New York tomorrow." He held up the other ticket. "This one's open-ended, for when I can get away from the farm. Maybe spend some time seeing what you've built, understanding your world better. But the farm, Pete's boy Danny knows this place almost as well as I do now. His agricultural science professors are mighty interested in some of those sustainable farming techniques your company's been developing, thinking we might set up some kind of internship program, give him college credit for managing things when I'm away." Eleanor's hand trembled as she touched the tickets. "You'd do that? Leave the farm?" "Not leaving, just expanding its horizons a bit." He smiled slightly. "Besides, someone needs to make sure you don't forget how real soil feels between your fingers, even in that fancy office of yours." A tear slipped down Eleanor's cheek. "I don't deserve you. Never was about deserving." He brushed the tear away with his thumb. "Just about choosing. Every day. Choosing to grow something worth keeping." She leaned into his touch. "I'll come. Back as often as I can. We can make this work. With the internet and video calls, and occasional flights on that company jet of yours," he teased gently. "Though I warn you, not sure your pilots ever had to land next to a soybean field before." Eleanor laughed through her tears. "I'll have them install a landing strip behind the barn, shall I?" "Now you're just showing off." Their laughter faded into comfortable silence. Outside, a mourning dove called, its melancholy song a reminder that summer was ending, change was coming. "I'm scared," Eleanor admitted quietly. "Scared that once I go back this will all feel like a dream, that we'll lose whatever we found here." Thomas took her hand, his calloused fingers intertwining with her manicured ones. "You know what farming teaches you? That everything has its season. Right now, your company needs you. Later, when the merger's done and things settle—" He squeezed her hand. "Well, harvest season comes around every year." Eleanor looked at their joined hands, then up at his face. "Promise me something. Anything. Promise me that when you come to New York, you'll wear these exact same work clothes to a board meeting. I want to see my directors' faces when they meet the farmer who inspired half their sustainable agriculture policies." Thomas chuckled. "Only if you promise to wear overalls the next time you give a TV interview about corporate success." "Deal." She stretched up on tiptoes to kiss his cheek, then pressed something into his hand. Her copy of the old bus ticket, the one she'd kept all these years. "Keep this for me, to remind us both that sometimes the best journeys are the ones that bring you home." Thomas tucked the ticket carefully into his shirt pocket, right over his heart. "Better get packed," he said softly. "That jet of yours won't wait forever, but you will, always have." While helping Eleanor pack for her return to New York, Thomas found the foundation papers tucked into her briefcase, dozens of pages outlining something called the Prairie Grove Initiative. He wouldn't have looked, but his own name caught his eye on the first page. "What's this?" he asked, holding up the document as Eleanor emerged from the guest room with another armload of clothes. She paused, a slight flush coloring her cheeks. "I was going to tell you about that. It's something I've been working on for the past year, ever since I first read about your organic certification in that farming journal." Thomas sat at the kitchen table, scanning the papers. "Says here something about turning farms into educational centers." Eleanor set down her clothes and joined him. her fingers tracing the foundation's logo, a stylized wheat stalk rising from an open book. I've been buying struggling family farms across the country, helping them transition to sustainable practices. But more than that, we're turning them into living classrooms. Her eyes lit up with passion, places where agricultural students can learn traditional farming wisdom alongside modern techniques, where urban kids can see where their food really comes from, where older farmers can pass on generations of knowledge. Thomas continued reading, his eyes widening. These numbers, the foundation, is funded with 1/4 of my personal fortune, Eleanor said quietly. Not the company's money, mine. I've been planning it for years, but I could never quite find the right model. She touched his arm gently. Until I came back here and saw what you've built. How you've merged traditional methods with new ideas. How you work with Danny and other young farmers. And you want my farm to be part of this? I want it to be the cornerstone. Eleanor pulled out another document. Architectural renderings of elegant glass buildings that somehow managed to complement his old barn rather than overshadow it. A state-of-the-art classroom facility, research labs for sustainable agriculture, studies, housing for student farmers, but all of it designed to preserve the working farm, to enhance it, not replace it. Thomas stared at the plans, seeing his family's legacy transformed, but not diminished. This is why you really came back, isn't it, to propose this? No, Eleanor's voice was firm. I came back because my car broke down and I needed shelter from a storm. Finding you again, realizing what we could still mean to each other, that wasn't part of any plan. She took his hand. But being here, seeing how you've kept faith with the land while embracing change, it showed me how to make the foundation's vision real. By using my farm as a model, by using our farm as a bridge. She squeezed his fingers. A bridge between past and future, between traditional wisdom and new technology, between the world I come from now and the one that shaped us both. Thomas looked out at his fields, their fields, seeing them through new eyes. He thought about Danny's enthusiasm for learning, about the local kids who always begged to help during harvest time, about Sarah's belief in nurturing growth of all kinds. Sarah would have loved this, he said softly. She always said the farm had more to teach than just farming. Eleanor's eyes were bright with understanding. She taught you that too, didn't she? How to open your heart to new possibilities while keeping faith with what matters. She did. Thomas turned back to the foundation papers. Says here you've already got 3 other farms in the program, in Kansas, Minnesota, and California. All family farms with deep roots in their communities. All facing the same pressures yours was, developers, corporate agriculture, an aging farming population. Eleanor stood, moving to the window. But this one, this farm, it would be special. Not just because of our history, but because you understand better than anyone how to balance progress with preservation. Thomas joined her at the window, their shoulders touching comfortably. Going to need some help, he said finally. Running a farm and an education center. I know some people who might be interested. Eleanor's smile was gentle. A certain CEO who's been thinking about spending more time working remotely from a farmhouse in Prairie Grove. Quite a commute for board meetings. Good thing I have that company jet. She turned to face him fully. Say yes, Thomas. Not for me, not even for the foundation. Say yes because you know, better than anyone, how much the next generation needs. To learn what this land can teach them. Thomas picked up the foundation papers again, focusing on the mission statement. His breath caught as he read it aloud. To preserve the wisdom of the land while nurturing the seeds of tomorrow. That's what my father used to say. I remembered. Eleanor's voice was soft. Every word you both taught me about farming, about stewardship, about the sacred trust between farmers and their land, it's all here. I just found a way to share it with the world. Thomas set the papers down carefully, then pulled Eleanor into his arms. Yes, he said simply, She melted against him, tension he hadn't even noticed flowing out of her shoulders. Yes, to the foundation, to building something new here. He pulled back slightly to look into her eyes. To everything. Outside, the afternoon sun gilded the fields, and a gentle breeze carried the promise of autumn. Inside, two people who had found their way home held each other, surrounded by papers that would help them share that home with future generations. The first signs of change came subtly to Prairie Grove Farm. A team of architects arrived, led by a woman who spent hours studying how the light moved across the old barn's weathered boards. Environmental engineers walked the fields with Thomas, nodding appreciatively at his cover crop rotation system. Eleanor conducted video meetings from the porch, city skylines replaced by swaying cornfields in her background. "The board actually loves it," she told Thomas one evening, closing her laptop after a particularly long session. "They think it adds authenticity to our sustainable agriculture initiatives, having their CEO literally sitting in the middle of a working farm." Thomas looked up from the architectural plans spread across the kitchen table. "Speaking of authenticity, these drawings for the new education center," he pointed to a detail that had caught his eye. "They've included Sarah's wildflower garden, even marked it as a meditation space for the students." Of course they did. Eleanor moved to stand behind him, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. "I told them about her belief in balance, how every farm needs a place where beauty grows alongside purpose." She paused. "Is it all right, sharing her garden like that?" Thomas covered her hand with his. "More than all right. Sarah always said, gardens were meant to be shared." He turned slightly to look at her. "Like love." The moment was interrupted by Danny bursting through the screen door, his college textbooks tucked under one arm, tablet computer in his free hand. "Mr. Reeves, those agricultural scientists from Eleanor's research division just sent over their analysis of our soil samples. You've got to see this." The enthusiasm in Danny's voice drew them both to the table where he spread out his materials. The young man had thrown himself into his role as liaison between the farm and Eleanor's foundation. With boundless energy, his agricultural science professors creating a special independent study program around the project. "See these mineral compositions?" Danny pointed to complex graphs on his tablet. "Your intuitive crop rotation patterns have actually created optimal soil conditions. They want to use it as a case study for traditional wisdom supporting modern sustainability theories." Thomas squinted at the scientific data, remembering simpler days of judging soil by sight and touch. But Eleanor leaned in, her business acumen shifting seamlessly into scientific interest. "Send this to our development team in California," she said. "They're working on similar soil enhancement projects." She glanced at Thomas. "Unless you'd rather keep your methods private?" He shook his head, smiling. "Knowledge wants to grow, just like crops. No sense keeping it buried." Later that evening, after Danny had left and the sunset painted the new architectural stakes in the south field golden, Thomas and Eleanor walked their familiar path to the old oak tree. A gentle breeze carried the promise of autumn, rustling, leaves that would soon turn brilliant colors. "Got the final paperwork today," Eleanor said, pulling an envelope from her pocket. "The foundation's formally registered with the farm as its flagship campus." She handed him the documents. "Just needs your signature, making it official." Thomas took the papers, but didn't open them immediately. Instead, he looked up at the oak's spreading branches, remembering two young people who'd once carved their initials in its bark. "Having second thoughts?" Eleanor asked softly. "No," he said, turning to face her. "Just remembering something my father told me once. Said every farmer plants trees he'll never sit under, tends soil that'll feed people. Long after he's gone," he gestured at the architectural stakes glinting in the distance. "Guess this is our way of doing that same thing." Eleanor's eyes softened with understanding. "We're not just building classrooms and research facilities. We're planting seeds for the future of farming itself." "Speaking of building," Thomas said, reaching into his own pocket, "got something to show you too." He handed her a small, worn key. Had it made today. Eleanor turned the key over in her hands, recognition dawning. Is this to the front door? Thomas felt a slight flush creep up his neck. Figured if you're going to be running a global company from my kitchen table, might as well make it official. Your kitchen table too. Tears welled in Eleanor's eyes as she closed her fingers around the key. Thomas. Now I know you'll still need to travel, he continued quickly, still have that fancy penthouse in New York and offices around the world. But I thought, well, everyone needs a home to come back to. Eleanor stepped closer, pressing her free hand against his chest, right where she knew he kept her old bus ticket in his shirt pocket. I already had a home to come back to, she said softly. Just took me 30 years to find my way there. The sound of vehicles approaching made them both turn. A small convoy of trucks was making its way up the farm's drive, the first delivery of materials for the education center's construction. The future arriving right on schedule. Ready for this? Eleanor asked, watching the trucks draw closer. Thomas pulled her closer, both of them observing as their two worlds began their first physical merger. Long as you are. They stood together, under the oak tree, watching the sunset paint their changing world in shades of promise. The key to their shared home caught the last rays of sunlight, gleaming like a beacon guiding them forward. The morning sun cast long shadows across Prairie Grove Farm as Thomas and Eleanor stood at the edge of the south field, watching the construction crew break ground on the education center. The mechanical growl of earth movers provided a strange counterpoint to the familiar sounds of farm life. Roosters crowing, wind rustling through cornstalks, the distant lowing of the neighbors' cattle. Found something interesting while going through old boxes, Eleanor said, pulling a worn notebook from her jacket pocket. My high school diary. Look at this entry. Thomas took the small book, recognizing the careful handwriting of a much younger Eleanor. The page was dated June 15th, 1973. Sat with Thomas on the tractor again today. He was talking about his dreams for the farm, sustainable practices, teaching the next generation, making something that would last. I told him about my dreams too, building something bigger than ourselves, changing how people think about agriculture and business. He actually listened, didn't laugh like Daddy does when I talk about business school. We spent hours planning how we could combine both our dreams someday. It probably sounds silly, but sitting there watching the sunset, everything seemed possible. Not so silly after all, Thomas said softly, running his finger over the faded ink. Just took a few decades. Longer than we planned. Eleanor leaned against him, watching as the construction team began marking the foundation lines. We were right, you know, both of us. Me about needing to build something bigger, you about staying connected to the land. She smiled. We just had to live those dreams separately before we could bring them together. A flash of movement caught their attention. Danny walking the site with the project manager, tablet in hand, enthusiastically pointing out features on the digital blueprints. The young man's passion for bridging traditional farming and modern. Technology reminded Thomas of himself at that age, full of ideas and energy. Sarah would love what we're doing, Eleanor said, voicing what Thomas had been thinking. She understood about dreams growing in their own time. Thomas nodded, remembering his late wife's quiet wisdom. She used to say, everything beautiful needs both roots and wings. He turned to Eleanor. Like us, maybe. You were the wings, flying out to change the world. I was the roots, keeping faith with the land. And now, Eleanor's eyes held a mixture of hope and certainty. Now, we're both. Thomas gestured toward the construction site, where the first corners of the foundation were being marked. Roots and wings together, they walked toward the old oak tree, their steps naturally falling into sync. A small group of graduate students from the state university was setting up monitoring equipment nearby, part of a study on traditional farming methods. Their eager faces reminded Thomas of his own youth, of endless summer evenings spent dreaming big dreams. Near the oak, a newly planted sapling caught the morning light. They'd chosen it together, an apple tree, its young branches reaching skyward while its roots sought depth in the soil that had nurtured Thomas's family for generations. "Remember what we used to say?" Eleanor asked, touching the sapling's smooth bark, "about wanting to change the world. Start with one seed," Thomas quoted their old motto. "Though I was probably thinking more about corn than multinational corporations at the time." Eleanor laughed, the sound carrying across the field to where Danny was now enthusiastically explaining something to the construction foreman. "And I was thinking more about corporate takeovers than cover crops. But look at us now, starting with seeds of all kinds." Thomas finished. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small pocket knife, the same one they'd used decades ago to carve. Their initials in the old oak. Eleanor's eyes widened in recognition. "You still have it? Some things you keep." He handed her the knife, nodding toward the young apple tree. "Want to make it official?" With careful strokes, Eleanor carved their initials into the sapling's trunk, adding the current year beneath. The simple act carried echoes of their teenage selves, but the hands performing it held the wisdom of lives fully lived. "There," she said, stepping back to admire her work. "TR plus EW 2025. No plus sign. This time," Thomas said quietly. "Already together." Eleanor's smile was radiant as she handed the knife back. "Together," she agreed. "Finally getting it right." The morning breeze carried the scent of freshly turned earth from the construction site, mixing with the familiar smells of the farm. In the distance, they could hear the sounds of progress, machinery preparing the ground for new buildings, voices calling measurements and instructions, the future taking shape one moment at a time. But here, under the old oak's protective branches, beside their newly marked sapling, time seemed to fold in on itself. Past and present merged like streams flowing into the same river, carrying their once separate dreams toward a shared horizon. 1 year later, the harvest moon once again hung full and golden over Prairie Grove Farm. The education center stood proudly alongside the old barn, its modern lines somehow complementing rather than competing with the traditional architecture. The evening air carried the sounds of celebration, laughter, music, and the happy chatter of people gathering for the center's official opening. Thomas stood at the edge of Sarah's wildflower garden, now expanded into a flourishing meditation space for students and visitors. He adjusted the collar of his dress shirt, a compromise between his usual work clothes and the formal attire such an occasion might normally demand. Eleanor had insisted he remain true to himself, even with news cameras and corporate board members in attendance. "There you are." Eleanor's voice came from behind him. She'd also struck a balance in her appearance, elegant but approachable, equally at home in the boardroom or the barn. "The students are asking for you. They want to hear about the winter wheat rotation plans." Thomas smiled, remembering how Danny had started that tradition, gathering young agricultural students around the kitchen table to learn farming wisdom alongside their technical studies. Now it had grown into something formal, regular sessions, where experience and innovation met in productive dialogue. "Looking at the garden first," he said softly, thinking about Sarah. Eleanor slipped her hand into his. "She'd love what it's become." "Look," she pointed to where several students sat on meditation benches, their notebooks open, sketching the native plants and making notes about sustainable landscaping. "Never thought I'd see research papers written about her wildflowers," Thomas mused. "Or Fortune 500 executives learning about soil composition in your barn," Eleanor added with a gentle laugh. "Life has a way of surprising us." They walked together toward the celebration, passing the young apple tree they'd marked with their initials. It had grown stronger over the past year, putting down roots while reaching toward the sky, much like their own relationship. The crowd parted naturally as they approached. Thomas recognized faces from both their worlds, local farmers in cleaned-up work clothes, corporate leaders in casual business attire, students eager to learn from both. Mae Wilson was there, proudly showing off her grandson who'd just enrolled in the center's first official semester. Pete Myers and his wife stood chatting with one of Eleanor's board members about traditional farming techniques. Danny, now the center's lead student coordinator, was demonstrating the new soil monitoring system to a group of agricultural technology developers. The young man caught Thomas's eye and grinned, giving him a thumbs up. "Time for the speeches," Eleanor murmured, squeezing his hand. Thomas had insisted on keeping his remarks brief and simple as he stood before the gathered crowd, looking out over the land his family had farmed for generations. The words came naturally. "This farm has always been about growth," he began. "Not just crops, but knowledge, understanding, love." He glanced at Eleanor, who smiled encouragingly. "My father used to say that every farmer plants seeds they'll never see grow. Today, we're planting something new, a place where old wisdom meets new ideas, where tradition and progress work together, where the next generation can learn both the science and the soul of farming." Eleanor stepped forward to join him, her corporate poise softened by genuine emotion. "When I left Prairie Grove 50 years ago, I thought I had to choose between my dreams and my roots. Today, we're proving that some choices don't have to be either or. They can be both and." As if on cue, the harvest moon rose higher, casting its gentle light over the gathered community. The old farmhouse stood warm and welcoming behind them, its porch light burning bright, no longer just Thomas's home or Eleanor's occasional refuge, but truly theirs together. Later, after the speeches and celebrations, after the last guests had departed and the night settled into peaceful quiet, Thomas and Eleanor sat on their porch swing, the same swing where they'd once shared teenage dreams, where he'd later sat, with Sarah planning their life together, where now new dreams were taking root. "Got the mail earlier," Thomas said, pulling an envelope from his pocket. New sign for the entrance arrived. Eleanor took it, carefully opening the package to reveal a hand-painted wooden sign. In elegant letters it read, "Reeves and Williams. Farm, growing wisdom, cultivating future. Perfect," she whispered, touching the letters gently. "Everything changes," Thomas mused, watching the moonlight silver the fields before them. "Everything stays the same. Maybe that's what love is, knowing which parts to keep, which parts to let grow different." Eleanor leaned against him, her head finding its familiar place on his shoulder. In the distance, an owl called, its voice carrying across fields that had nurtured generations and would now nurture new kinds of growth. "We got it right this time," she said softly. Thomas pulled her closer, feeling the rightness of their hard-won happiness. "No," he corrected gently. "We got it right both times. Just had to wait for the harvest."